Some men walk into Pelican Bay Prison and never truly leave again. Not because their sentence is life without parole, but because once the door of solitary confinement closes behind them, time itself seems to end. Days lose meaning, years blur together, and for some inmates, the world shrinks to a concrete box where silence becomes the loudest sound they know. This is Pelican Bay Prison in California, a place designed not just to hold bodies, but to test the limits of the human mind. Pelican Bay State Prison sits in the far northwest corner of California, near the Oregon border, surrounded by dense forests, cold air, and isolation that mirrors what happens inside its walls. From the outside, it looks like a remote fortress, intentionally placed far from major cities, families, and public attention. But what made Pelican Bay infamous was not its location. It was what happened deep inside its most feared unit, the Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU. The SHU was not built for rehabilitation. It was built for control. Concrete cells, solid steel doors, no windows to the outside world. And for decades, thousands of inmates were placed there for one reason above all others: indefinite solitary confinement. At Pelican Bay, solitary did not always come with a release date. Many inmates were sent to the SHU, not for violent acts committed inside the prison, but for alleged gang affiliation. Sometimes the evidence was as thin as a drawing, a tattoo, a book, or an informant's accusation. Once labeled a gang member, an inmate could be sent to solitary for years, sometimes decades, without ever breaking a rule again. Inside the SHU, the cell measured roughly 8 by 10 feet. A poured concrete bed, a concrete desk, a toilet and sink combined into one steel fixture. The walls were thick, gray, and cold. The door was solid metal, with only a small slot for food trays and handcuffs. No windows, no clocks, no mirrors. Light came from fluorescent bulbs that hummed day and night, blurring the line between morning and midnight. Inmates spent between 22 and 24 hours a day alone in these cells. Meals were pushed through a slot. Conversations were shouted through walls. Touching another human being could go years without happening. Some inmates reported not seeing a tree, feeling rain, or breathing fresh air for more than a decade. Exercise, when allowed, took place in what inmates called dog runs, small, concrete enclosures with high walls and a patch of sky overhead. No equipment, no grass, just pacing in circles, alone, under the open sky for an hour before being locked back inside. At first, many inmates believed they could endure it. They told themselves it was temporary. They counted days, then weeks, then months. But Pelican Bay had a way of breaking those systems of hope. When there was no clear end date, time became a weapon. Sleep patterns collapsed. Some inmates slept all day to escape boredom. Others couldn't sleep at all, trapped in their thoughts as silence amplified every fear and regret. Without normal human interaction, the mind began to turn inward, and not always gently. Former prisoners described hearing voices that weren't there, seeing shadows move along the walls, feeling an overwhelming sense of panic without knowing why. Anger came suddenly, without warning. Depression settled in like a permanent fog. Some inmates began talking to themselves just to hear a human voice. Pelican Bay officials maintained that the SHU was necessary to control violence and gang activity. They argued that isolating influential gang members kept the rest of the prison safer. But critics, mental health experts, and human rights organizations told a different story. One where prolonged isolation caused severe psychological damage, often irreversible. Studies linked long-term solitary confinement to anxiety disorders, hallucinations, memory loss, emotional breakdowns, and suicidal thoughts. Yet at Pelican Bay, solitary was not measured in days or weeks, it was measured in years. One inmate reportedly spent over 25 years in the SHU. Another entered solitary in his early 20s and emerged in his 40s, emotionally stunted, socially withdrawn, and struggling to function in a world that had moved on without him. Family visits were rare and difficult. Pelican Bay's remote location meant loved ones had to travel long distances, often at great expense. And even when visits happened, inmates in the SHU were separated by thick glass. No hand-holding, no embraces. Conversations conducted through phones, under watchful eyes, with guards timing every minute. For many inmates, the absence of human touch became one of the most painful punishments of all. Years passed without a hug, a handshake, or even accidental contact. Psychologists later describe this as social death, when a person is alive but stripped of meaningful human connection. The silence inside Pelican Bay was not peaceful. It was oppressive. Every sound, a distant door slam, footsteps in the hallway, the buzz of lights, became magnified. Inmates learned to recognize guards by the sound of their boots. Some could tell the time of day by routine noises alone. Others lost track completely, drifting through days that felt identical. Resistance took quiet forms. Some inmates exercised obsessively, doing thousands of push-ups in their cells. Others read whatever books they could get, sometimes rereading the same novels dozens of times. Writing became a lifeline. Letters to family, legal documents, journals never meant to be read. But even these coping mechanisms were fragile. When books were delayed, when mail was restricted, when minor rule violations resulted in further punishment, despair returned quickly. Over time, Pelican Bay became a symbol, not just of harsh incarceration, but of how far a system could go when punishment replaced rehabilitation. Lawsuits began to pile up. Former inmates spoke publicly about the mental damage they suffered. Hunger strikes erupted inside the prison, with thousands of inmates refusing food to protest indefinite solitary confinement. The hunger strikes brought national attention. For the first time, the public began to hear stories from inside the SHU. Stories of men who had not committed violent acts in decades, yet remained locked in isolation with no clear path out. Under mounting pressure, California eventually changed some of its policies. Indefinite solitary confinement was reduced. New review processes were introduced. Some inmates were released from the SHU into general population units. But for many, the damage was already done. Even after leaving solitary, former SHU inmates struggled to adjust. Noise felt overwhelming. Crowds caused panic. Simple social interactions felt foreign. Years of isolation had rewired their minds. Freedom, when it came, did not feel free. Pelican Bay Prison still stands today. The SHU still exists, though in a modified form. And the legacy of its solitary confinement program continues to shape debates about punishment, human rights, and the psychological limits of isolation. Because Pelican Bay is not just a prison. It is a warning. A reminder of what happens when a system decides that breaking the mind is an acceptable form of control, and a place where, for many who entered, solitary did not just last years. It changed them forever. The most dangerous part of Pelican Bay Prison was not the razor wire, the armed towers, or the heavy steel doors. It was what happened quietly, slowly, inside the minds of the men locked away in solitary confinement. The damage was invisible at first. It did not arrive all at once. It crept in through silence, repetition, and the absence of human connection. When inmates first entered the security housing unit, many believed they could outthink it. They created routines. Wake up, exercise, read, sleep, repeat. They marked days on scraps of paper or scratched lines into books. They told themselves that discipline would protect them. But Pelican Bay was designed to dismantle routines, not support them. There were no normal markers of time. Lights remained on. Meals arrived at unpredictable hours. Seasons changed outside, but inside the cell, the temperature barely shifted. Without windows, inmates could not see the sun rise or set. Weeks passed without any sensory reminder that time was moving forward. The human brain, evolved to track cycles and patterns, began to drift. Psychologists later explained that prolonged isolation disrupts the brain's ability to regulate emotions and perceive reality. At Pelican Bay, this disruption was not a side effect. It was a constant condition. Men who had once been socially dominant found themselves speaking to walls. Others became hypersensitive to sound. jolting at every footstep in the corridor. Some inmates reported feeling their thoughts loop endlessly, replaying past mistakes, imagined futures, and unresolved anger until it became unbearable. Anger, in particular, had nowhere to go. In general population, tension could be released through conversation, exercise, or social interaction. In solitary, anger had no outlet. It built pressure. Some inmates punched walls until their knuckles split open. Others screamed into their cells, knowing no one would answer. Then came the hallucinations. Inmates described seeing insects crawling across the floor that vanished when they blinked. Faces appeared in the concrete. Voices whispered their names at night. Some felt watched, even when alone. The mind, deprived of stimulation, began to create its own. Sleep offered no relief. Nightmares were common. So was insomnia. Without a natural day-night cycle, the body's internal clock collapsed. Some inmates slept in short bursts. Others stayed awake for days. Fatigue blurred reality even further. One former SHU inmate later said that the hardest part was not fear, but confusion. He no longer trusted his own thoughts. He could not tell whether memories were real or imagined. Conversations replayed in his head, changing each time. The longer he stayed in isolation, the less confident he became in his own mind. Mental health treatment inside the SHU was limited. Therapy sessions, when they happened at all, took place through cell doors or thick glass. There was no privacy. Guards stood nearby. Inmates were expected to discuss deeply personal thoughts, while knowing every word was monitored. Many stopped trying. Self-harm became a quiet epidemic. Some inmates cut themselves just to feel something. Others swallowed objects, hoping to be taken to the medical unit for brief human interaction. Suicide attempts were frequent, and when they happened, the response was often punishment rather than care. Inmates placed on suicide watch were sometimes stripped naked and placed in bare cells under constant observation. The message was clear: suffering would be controlled, not healed. Pelican Bay's defenders argued that these measures were necessary to maintain order. They claimed that inmates in the SHU were too dangerous to mix with others. But critics pointed out a troubling reality. Many inmates placed in solitary had committed no violent acts for years. Their continued isolation was based on status, not behavior. Gang validation became a trap. Once labeled a gang affiliate, an inmate's only way out of the SHU was often debriefing, providing information about gang activity. But debriefing came with risks. Inmates feared retaliation against themselves or their families. Some refused on principle. Others simply had no information to give. So they stayed. Years passed. Decades in some cases. Men entered solitary in their physical prime and emerged middle-aged or elderly, emotionally frozen in time. Social skills eroded. Eye contact felt threatening. Simple conversations became overwhelming. When some inmates were finally released into the general population, the transition was brutal. The noise alone was unbearable. Doors slamming, voices echoing. The constant movement of people triggered anxiety and panic attacks. Men who had survived years in isolation now struggled to function around others. Outside observers began to notice the pattern. Lawyers documented cases. Psychiatrists testified. Former inmates spoke publicly about their experiences. The stories were strikingly similar, despite coming from men with different backgrounds, crimes, and personalities. Pelican Bay was not creating safer inmates. It was creating damaged ones. Public pressure mounted. Human rights organizations compared the SHU to psychological torture. International bodies criticized the United States for its use of prolonged solitary confinement. The term living death appeared repeatedly in reports describing Pelican Bay. Inside the prison, resistance grew. In 2011, inmates across different racial and gang lines coordinated a hunger strike. Thousands refused food. Their demands were simple: an end to indefinite solitary confinement, fair review processes, and basic human dignity. The hunger strike shocked prison officials. It revealed something Pelican Bay had failed to extinguish: solidarity. Men who had been isolated for years found a way to act together, even from separate cells. The strike drew national media attention. Families of inmates spoke out. Lawmakers asked questions. For the first time, Pelican Bay's practices faced serious scrutiny. The state responded slowly, cautiously, and defensively. Some reforms were announced. Review processes were modified. The number of inmates held in long-term solitary began to decrease. But change did not erase the past. For those who had spent years in the SHU, the damage lingered. Some could not tolerate silence anymore. Others feared it. Many struggled with depression long after their release from isolation. Relationships were difficult. Trust was fragile. Pelican Bay had taught them how to survive alone, but not how to live with others. The prison still operated. The walls still stood. And while the most extreme forms of indefinite solitary were reduced, isolation remained a central tool of control. The question was no longer whether Pelican Bay had broken men, it was how many, and at what cost. Because once the mind adapts to total isolation, it never fully returns to what it was before. And for the men who lived through it, Pelican Bay was not just a chapter in their sentence. It was a chapter written into their psyche, one that could not be erased. For some men, the door at Pelican Bay Prison eventually opened. The steel slid back. The cuffs were removed. And after years, sometimes decades, of isolation, they were told they were going back to the general population, or in rare cases, going home. But freedom, when it finally came, did not arrive as relief. It arrived as shock. The first thing many noticed was noise. After years of silence, broken only by distant echoes and mechanical sounds, the world felt unbearably loud. Voices overlapped. Doors slammed. Footsteps came from every direction. Even laughter sounded aggressive. Men who had survived solitary confinement now found themselves overwhelmed by the presence of other human beings. Some froze. Others lashed out. A few begged to be returned to their cells, not because they preferred punishment, but because isolation had become familiar. Pelican Bay had taught them how to survive alone, but it had stripped away the skills needed to exist among others. Psychologists call this institutionalization. At Pelican Bay, it took on a deeper form. Years in solitary had rewired how the brain processed danger, trust, and emotion. Every movement felt threatening. Every interaction required conscious effort. Eye contact triggered anxiety. Standing too close felt unbearable. Men who had once navigated prison hierarchies with confidence now struggled to hold simple conversations. They spoke too softly or too loudly. They misread social cues. They reacted defensively to harmless gestures. The prison that claimed to control violence had created men who no longer understood how to regulate it. For those released directly from Pelican Bay into the outside world, the transition was even harsher. The sky felt too wide. Stores felt crowded. Choices, what to eat, where to go, how to spend time, became sources of stress instead of freedom. Many former inmates described feeling exposed, as if they were constantly being watched, even when alone. Technology had moved on without them. Years in solitary meant missing entire eras of change. Smartphones, social media, online banking, these were foreign concepts. Some men struggled to use basic devices. Others avoided them entirely, retreating into isolation again, this time by choice. Relationships suffered. Family members expected reunions filled with joy, but often encountered distance instead. Former SHU inmates struggled to express emotion. Hugs felt uncomfortable. Conversations felt exhausting. Loved ones misinterpreted silence as rejection, not realizing it was a survival reflex learned inside a concrete cell. Romantic relationships were especially difficult. Trust required vulnerability, and vulnerability had been dangerous for too long. Many former inmates remained alone, not because they wanted to, but because they no longer knew how to connect. Mental health support after release was limited. Therapy appointments were hard to access. Medication helped some, but could not undo years of sensory deprivation. Nightmares persisted. Panic attacks struck without warning. Depression followed quietly. Some former Pelican Bay inmates returned to prison, not because they committed serious crimes, but because life on the outside felt unmanageable. Structure, however harsh, was familiar. Freedom required skills they had never been allowed to practice. Meanwhile, Pelican Bay's legacy continued to unfold beyond its walls. The lawsuits brought by former inmates forced the state of California to confront uncomfortable truths. Court documents revealed patterns of abuse, neglect, and psychological harm. Expert testimony described solitary confinement at Pelican Bay as a form of torture incompatible with modern standards of human rights. Policy changes followed slowly. The use of indefinite solitary confinement was curtailed. New programs were introduced to transition inmates out of isolation. Some SHU units were repurposed. On paper, Pelican Bay had changed. But policies could not erase history. Men who had spent decades in solitary would carry Pelican Bay with them for the rest of their lives. No reform could give them back lost years, missed funerals, or relationships that faded under the weight of absence. And the debate did not end with California. Pelican Bay became a reference point in national conversations about incarceration. Other states faced scrutiny for similar practices. Lawmakers questioned whether solitary confinement truly made prison safer, or simply postponed violence by burying it deep inside damaged minds. Former prison officials spoke out, some admitting that isolation had been overused. Others defended it as a necessary evil. The country remained divided. But one truth became increasingly difficult to ignore. Prolonged solitary confinement did not just punish inmates, it transformed them. Pelican Bay had shown what happens when isolation becomes policy rather than exception. It revealed the fragile boundary between control and cruelty, between discipline and psychological destruction. For the men who lived through it, Pelican Bay was not defined by walls or watchtowers. It was defined by silence. By years spent alone with thoughts that grew darker over time. By a system that measured safety in days without incident, not in human cost. Some former inmates chose to speak publicly, despite the pain of revisiting their past. They testified before lawmakers. They spoke to journalists. They told their stories not for sympathy, but as warning. They described the SHU not as a place of reflection, but as a place where identity eroded, where men forgot the sound of their own voice, where hope had to be rationed carefully, because believing too strongly in release made the waiting unbearable. Others chose silence. They rebuilt their lives quietly, carrying Pelican Bay inside them without explanation. They avoided attention. They avoided crowds. They avoided memories. And Pelican Bay itself remained. Still standing near the Oregon border, still operating, still holding men whose lives unfolded behind concrete and steel. The SHU no longer functioned as it once did, but its shadow remained long and unmistakable. Because Pelican Bay was never just about one prison. It was about a philosophy, the belief that isolation could control what society feared without consequence. The belief that removing human connection could produce order. The belief that survival alone was enough. Pelican Bay proved otherwise. It showed that when solitary never ends, it does not simply contain violence. It reshapes it. It turns inward. It lingers. It follows men long after the door opens. And in the end, the most haunting truth about Pelican Bay is not what happened inside its cells. It is what happened after. When men walked out carrying invisible scars, struggling to relearn how to live in a world that had never stopped moving. Pelican Bay Prison remains a name etched into the history of American incarceration, not as a symbol of safety, but as a reminder of how easily punishment can become something else entirely. A place where solitude was meant to control the body, but ended up redefining the mind.